It's a real honor to speak have this presentation here to introduce and open the conference. So the title of my presentation is Scientific Practice and the Knowledge Machine, How to Educate Science. So of course, because of the theme of this conference, I will speak about how to educate science, but I will speak even a bit more about the knowledge machine. And maybe some of you know that this is the title of a book written by Michael Stevens, quite a popular book, recently published, and I will give some comments on this book. So actually I will start with trying to show that there is a relationship between science education and a general view of science. And then I only want to make one point, that a very popular way of presenting a view of science is done by the book The Knowledge Machine, and I will try to show that maybe something is wrong in this way of presenting science. So that's all I'm going to do in this 15 minutes. Now, let's see if I can do away with this. You can see the slide's not moving. Okay, I think I need to do this again. Hopefully it works out well now. So what I want to do first is a small detour by showing that there is a relationship between science communication and the view of science. Now, traditionally, the way to communicate science was the transmission model. And this has been changed over time by the transaction model of science communication. So what does these models mean? Now, the aim of the transmission model was to put the universal knowledge of science in the minds of the ignorant public in the most attractive and convincing form. So the idea was that the scientists knew everything and the audience knew nothing, and they have to transplant the knowledge into the heads of the audience. And on the background, there is an idea of a view of science, and that's based on the idea that scientists are neutral and science presents the truth about the world. But this view of science has changed over time. So that's on the back of my slide. So at the moment, I think there's another view of science quite dominant, and that is all knowledge is provisional and involves social, economical, and political processes. And then you come to another way of communicating science. Well, it doesn't work. That is then the aim is that scientists, scientific practitioners, and the public engage in a dialogue to come to new insights, alternative definitions, and solutions. So now the audience is speaking back to the scientists, and you have to take care of this, and this all changed because the general view of science changed. So my point is that there is a relationship between the way science is communicated and the view of science. And now my thesis is, for the rest of this lecture, next to the content of scientific knowledge and all kinds of pedagogical ideas, a general view of science also determines the way science is educated. Now I turn to Michael Stevens' book on the knowledge machine. I'm not sure, has somebody read the book over here? Nobody. This is science education. It's very interesting to read. It's a great book, although I have some comments on it. So the knowledge machine is about the iron rule. It is a great book to read, and Michael Stevens wants to raise two questions. The first is, what distinguishes science from other human activities, like art, politics, economics, etc.? And the other is, why did modern science not emerge until the 17th century? Now, I will only focus on the first question, what distinguishes science from other human activities? And the short answer of Michael Stevens is, it is the iron rule. So what is the iron rule? Now, simply said, it is that science and scientific results are always tested, empirically tested. That's the simple thing. Scientific arguments are not argued by way of philosophical ideas, ideological positions, economical forces. No, evidence is all that matters in science. So this sounds quite simple, and Michael Stevens understands that it's not that simple. So then he adds something to this first definitions, and he says, well, sometimes there are debates between scientists. There are controversies. And then he says to conduct an empirical test to decide, for example, between a pair of hypotheses, perform an experiment or measurement, one of whose possible outcomes can be explained by one hypothesis, but not the other. So empirical testing is central to science. And if there's a controversy, you need to have a crucial experiment. But we know from historical experiments and historical examples that it's not always possible to make a decision between competing hypotheses based on empirical evidence, based on a crucial experiment. So that's why Michael Stevens adds something extra to it. And this he calls the Baconian convergence. Francis Bacon was one of these guys who thought about science methods in the 17th century. And for him, doing experiments, doing observations, doing away with prejudices, like he calls it the idols, is a great thing about science. So what then is Baconian convergence? It is that over time, evidence accumulates. And he says plausibility rankings, estimates of hypothesis likelihood begin to converge, ever less disagreement. So we understand science as to be progressive because over time, the amount of evidence is becoming greater and greater. And then he adds another principle, he calls the Tychonian principle. And I'm not sure if he does really explain it in the right way, but it is that in scientific experiments and observations, we can be very precise. Predictions are very detailed. And this also counts for the reliability of evidence. And this Tychonian principle, like the other principles, are connected to the big hero of his book, Isaac Newton. So we talk a lot about people who caused the scientific revolution in the 16th and 17th century, like Copernicus, Kepler, Galilei, Newton. This big hero is Isaac Newton, because Newton is really trying to base his ideas on evidence. And Newton even writes the famous sentence, "I do not feign hypothesis. I only argue from evidence." And now he is also critical, Michael Stevens, about Isaac Newton, because we know that Newton also spent a lot of writings on theology and alchemy, but he seems to be separated. He seems to be able to separate this type of knowledge, this type of thinking, theology and alchemy. He seems to separate it from science. So Isaac Newton still is the big hero of Michael Stevens. And I think that other historians of science would be a little more critical on Newton. So let's do one step back, because the knowledge machine is also about frailty and subjectivity. But before I go into this theme, I want to emphasize that I think it's a great book, especially now we are living in a time of alternative facts, fake news, lies, politics, and war. It is great that somebody really give all the emphasis on facts, on empirical knowledge. I think that is really needed. But on the other hand, we know there are a lot of insights from philosophers of science, and they tell us that scientific results are at least partly determined by personal and professional interests, by political values, economic forces, and sometimes even, hopefully, incidents by manipulation and fraud. Just think about books of Thomas Kuhn, Bruno Latour, Harry Collins, and on the right you see a study from my university about the commodification of scientific knowledge. Now, the point is that Michael Stevens himself liked to emphasize that science also has to do with human frailty, and he tells about the essential subjectivity of science. So Michael Stevens does not deny that things Kuhn, Latour, and others wrote are important. He stresses the fact that scientists are humans and can be and have their own perspective, and that can distort their knowledge. I just have some quotations to make this point. First of all, he talks about human frailty, and then he writes, the weighing of evidence is seldom objective, seldom particularly methodological, always open to personal and political influence, and guided as much by expedience and self-interest as by logic. And he writes, available evidence is not ignored, but humans are heavily influenced also by the temperament, social position, etc. And then about subjectivity, another chapter in his book. Here he writes, the evaluation of hypothesis in the light of evidence is thoroughly subjective, fluid all the way down to its core. And he says, well, there's a role for plausibility rankings, subjectively formed estimates of hypothesis likelihood linked to a pre-existing scheme for interpreting evidence. So Michael Stevens is not simply going back to logical positivism. In the 20th century, the beginnings of it, that was an influential view of science. He is critical, but still he thinks it's possible to think about scientific results only by way of looking to empirical facts. Now, this is the way he does argue this point. He tells us that there is a big difference, you can make a big distinction between scientific reasoning on the one hand and scientific argument on the other. And in some way, scientists have to go from scientific reasoning to scientific arguments. Now, the domain of scientific reasoning is characterized by subjectivity. And it is a scientific practice, the context of discovery, human frailty, subjective perspectives play a major role over here. In the other domain, that is, according to Michael Stevens, objective. And that is, you find these objective arguments in journals, on conferences like our conference. Now, the big question for me was, reading the book, how can we go from the domain of scientific reasoning to the domain of scientific argument? How can it be that subjective scientists become at one moment objective scientists? And I've been looking for this transformation in the book, and I could only find this kind of magic key. And he tells us make more measurements, conduct new experiments. So that's the Baconian principle. But still then, I would like to raise the question, how can this more measurements and conducting new experiments become objective in one moment? If it is subjective from the beginning, how can it be that if you do more, come over on the table with more evidence, that it can be objective at a certain moment? So I doubt that this is possible. And therefore, I think I have a kind of new proposal. And I don't think it's a good idea to go back to relativism. I would hold on this main idea that evidence is very important in science, but I will like to add another characteristic of science, and that is intersubjectivity. So in all moments of scientific research, there are other people, other experts who are looking with us to our research and judge it in peer review by replicating, by reproducing experiments, by trying to match results in one scientific field to match it with results in other scientific fields. So this is a simple picture of how this could work. It's called the knowledge filter, and it is drawn by Bauer. He wrote an interesting book on this way. So the one big thing in science, according to Bauer, is that we have feedback mechanisms, and feedback mechanisms are practiced by other scientists, and therefore I call it intersubjectivity. Now, this system does not work from its own, but it needs some help, and therefore I refer in my last slide to the work of Len Longino, who has an honorary doctorate at my university, and she wrote that indeed intersubjectivity can even guarantee a form of objectivity if intersubjectivity obeys to 4 characteristics. And these are these characteristics. He says, well, we need in science places and time for real debate. So there are to be recognized avenues for criticism. It must be possible that we criticize each other. And to criticize each other in a sense, in a meaningful way, we also need shared standards. And it can be quite hard. And so we need same ways of judging science, judging scientific results. So if you have these standards, it's easier to talk with each other and come to agreements. And the third one is that you take community response seriously and not just say, okay, I understand your point, but really go into it and see what the consequences are for your own research. And the last point is equality of intellectual authority. The student can have nice critics, also, of course, a professor from Harvard, but every comment has to be taken seriously. That's the idea of the last one. Every voice in science counts. So I think if we are educating science, we have to tell our students that empirical evidence is very important. But empirical evidence is not enough. We also need consensus and ways to come to consensus, and therefore we need feedback mechanisms and subjectivity. Well, that's the only point I was making. So thank you for paying attention to this opening lecture, and enjoy the conference.